Hello viewers, welcome to week 2, lecture 3 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about two major new critics, W.K. Wimsatt and Beardsley. And in the previous lecture, as we have already talked about the basic tenets of new criticism, in which I talked about the basic principles that various new critics employ in appreciation and criticism of literature. So in this lecture, I am going to focus on two important essays which played very important role in propounding the cause of new criticism, the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. The point of these essays that they warn the readers against fallacies in criticism. So these are two kinds of fallacies that they find. And the critics, as we know, these younger critics were dissatisfied with biohistorical approaches and subjective literary criticism. So therefore, they talked about a criticism or they promoted a literary criticism which focuses particularly on the text. W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley, they published the work The Verbal Icon, Studying in the Meaning of Poetry in 1954, which contains these two essays, the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. These essays were written earlier. The intentional fallacy was written in 1946 and the affective fallacy was written in 49. If we look at the general position of the new critics, we find that how they warn readers against certain temptations. These temptations may have root in what Hippolyte Adolphe Taine, a French critic and historian, right, a positivistic thinker, right, he said that a work of art comes into existence by three factors: the man, the moment and the milieu. What they mean that the author and the time in which the author is writing, the socio-economic conditions, the historical conditions and the climate, right. So all these things are very crucial in the genesis of a work of art, and we cannot understand a work of art unless we take into all these considerations seriously. New critics go against this notion and they try to minimize the recourse to history, biography and society. So what they are saying that a work of art should not be analyzed in the moral and psychological context of impact. Poetry should be treated as poetry and not as anything else. Let us start, what are the salient features of the essay, The Intentional Fallacy, written jointly by Wimsatt and Beardsley. In the screen, capital W and B, they will be representing Wimsatt and Beardsley. If I write IF, that will be representing intentional fallacy, and AF for affective fallacy. So let us talk about this intentional fallacy. The debate about the work and the intention of the author, the relationship between them, it has been a debatable topic. And before Beardsley and Wimsatt, wrote this essay, the debate was already there in discussions of Professor Lewis and Tilliard, especially their work, The Personal Heresy. And some of the debates are, found in the Southern and Kenyon reviews, which we have already referred to the previous lecture. So, Wimsatt and Beardsley argue that the design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art. You know, they say that if you look at intentional fallacy, it has a corollary with certain terms which are preferred in romantic criticism. So, terms such as inspiration, authenticity, originality, biography, literary history, scholarship, elusiveness, all these terms have been idealized by the romantics. You know, one important proponent who supported this romantic theory of criticism was Professor Stoll, who belongs to the intentional school. Professor Stoll, you know, gives the argument. He says that a poem is not an accident. You know, words in a poem do not come from the blue. They do not come from the hat. These words come from the head of an author, head of a human being. And therefore, they come always with a design, with a planning. So, if it was the line of argument that Professor Stoll had taken, so in that way, he said that what will be the task of a critic? The task of a critic is to ascertain what was the plan of the poet when he went for writing that poem. The other thing that a critic should ask, that was the poet successful in doing that? So the point is that here we find that, as Professor Stoll has said, that the task of a critic is to, make an investigation into the plan of the poem, what the poet had planned, and whether he has been able to achieve that target successfully or not. And in this way, Wimsatt and Beardsley say that if we focus on all these concerns, so the work of art will go out of our attention and critics will be busy in doing all these kinds of unnecessary investigations which are external to the work of art. So they say that, Wimsatt and Beardsley argue, they respond to this question, to this point, and they say that, a poem is proof of all these things. For example, whether a poet has been successful in realizing his intention, the poem is a proof. And if a poet has not been able to realize his intention, then it is quite unrelated to that poem at all, because that is not there in poem. So in what way you will establish a correlation between what the writer had thought and what he has written if there is no relation between them? So in all cases, poem is the sole proof of what has the author planned or what he has been able to achieve. And in this way, a critic's focus should be on the work of art, on the poem itself, right? They were influenced by what Archibald MacLeish had said, a poetry should not mean but be, right? So, relevant. Further, continuing this argument, Professor Stoll says that, a poem is not a critic's consciousness, it is a poet's consciousness. So, criticism of that art should not be given preference over the intention of the author. So, but arguing that point or contending that point, Wimsatt and Beardsley say that a poem is detached from the author at the time of birth. It is beyond his control, and in this way, the poem is the property of the critics and the readers, right? So they go on to say, Wimsatt and Beardsley, they go on to say that a poem belongs to the public. It belongs to the language of human beings, right? It is an object of public. So, for example, they refer to Professor Welleck, who says that a poem is a system of norms extracted from every individual's experience, right? So, Beardsley and Wimsatt, they are trying to assert that poet is not an authority. Once a work is done, the work is itself an authority, right? So, they say that intentional fallacy is basically a romantic fallacy. Wimsatt and Beardsley in this essay, they go on to take the entire history of romantic criticism. They refer to, Longinus as the arch-romantic critic who says that sublimity is the echo of a great soul. right? It means any poem, you can judge the worth of a poem, its sublimity, only if you are able to judge the mind and soul of the author. Similarly, Goethe is another exemplar of this romantic criticism, and Goethe in his work says that what is a constructive criticism? So he says that a constructive criticism is one in which the critic asks three questions. First question, what was the plan of the author or the writer? Second question, was this plan reasonable? And third question, was the author able to achieve that plan, achieve that target? Right. So in this way, these three. He comes, to crochet. Then he says that crochet is the culmination of this romantic criticism or that theory. And what he says that crochet says that the beautiful is the successful intuition experience, ugly is the unsuccessful. So crochet goes on to emphasize that the private part of a creation, that is the mind of the poet, the intention of the poet, is, aesthetic fact. The medium, I mean the poem, is not an aesthetic fact. So he says that the business of aesthetics is to, investigate into the intention and its beautiful relationship with the object. The object is secondary. Right. So here we find that how they have given very strong arguments in favor of this intentional, kind of criticism. Right. So Crochet also argues that if you look at a painting, if you look at a work of art, which was written 200, 300 years back, with the passage of time in reprinting or in recopying, there may be distortions. A painting may be distorted. So the real worth of the painting can be ascertained only when you know the intention of the author. Right. So these are their arguments, and therefore Crochet concludes that historical interpretations are the best guides. So the intentional fallacy. Wimsatt and Beardsley reverse the understanding of internal and external. For example, they say that usually what is our understanding? We think that internal is the intention of the author, external is the work of art. They reverse this understanding. They say that internal is the work of art, external is the related to the intention of the author. So the intention is external, the work is internal. So these two domains are interchanged. We can look at the distinction between internal and external. So internal is also public, discovered through the semantics and syntax of a poem, through habitual knowledge of language, grammars and dictionaries. Language and culture in general source of the poem. So far as external is concerned, external is private and idiosyncratic. It is not a part of a work as a linguistic fact. They say that intention is not related to the poem at all. The task of a critic is to look at the work, and intention is not related to work, therefore it is external, it is not related to the linguistic fact. Revelations, journals, letters, reported conversations, they all are external, which might have gone into the genesis of that poem. So how or why the poet wrote that poem? These questions are irrelevant and unnecessary. Whether he wrote it in memory of any lady, whether he wrote sitting at a lawn or in a park, whether he wrote on the occasion of death of his friend or brother, all these things are quite unnecessary. Further, they go on to say that they appreciate Coleridge in that way. They say that Coleridge was a critic who was interested in psychology, and he has made whole lot of psychology in developing literary criticism, but he knew what was the threshold, that a literary critic will have to be a literary critic, he cannot be a psychologist. So, Wimsatt and Beardsley, taking inspiration from Coleridge, they go on to say that how psychology of composition should be complemented with the science of objective evaluation. So, he says that terms such as sincerity, fidelity, spontaneity, authenticity, genuineness, or originality, which were often admired by the romantic critics or romantic theorists, they should be matched with the terms such as integrity, relevance, unity, function, maturity, and subtlety. And these words are used in context of objective evaluation, or these words constitute a science of objective evaluation. Right. For example, he goes on to say, he gives the example of Kubla Khan, and they say that if you want to truly appreciate Kubla Khan, so they say that the poem itself has sufficient evidence for its interpretation and explanation and understanding as a linguistic unit. They disagree with the approach that Professor Lewis has taken, that he goes on to ascertain various sources which were responsible for the making of that poem. So in this way, that was a flawed approach. Similarly, in this work, The Intentional Fallacy, they take on analysis of many poems. For example, Donne's Valediction of Forbidding Morning. They say that John Donne was very well versed with what was called new science at his time. He was very well versed with the theories of Kepler, Galileo, Gilbert, and Clovis, right? But to understand a poem like Valediction of Forbidding Morning, in which John Donne is talking about the movement of spheres, that celestial bodies and their movements is silent. They're talking about tremors of earth. They're talking about the movement of these celestial bodies. So these critics say that if to evaluate John Donne, you have to go into all those theories of new sciences, it means you are trying to say that the English language and the potential of English language is very weak. Similarly, so they go on to say, to make the geocentric and heliocentric antithesis, the core of the metaphor is to disregard the English language, to prefer private evidence to public, external to internal. Similarly, they give the example of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which is an elusive poem. And what they say that, if we go about this intentional fallacy, so, a critic will keep roaming in works such as Fraser's The Golden Bough, or Miss Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance, or Elizabethan dramatists who happen to be the source of Eliot's creation of the Wasteland. So the fact is that the true analysis of Wasteland is not possible if a critic keeps roaming into those external areas, right? They give very important, very interesting example, like at one time when Eliot was said that did he write those lines, the sound of horns and motors which shall bring Sweeney to Mrs. Porter in spring day. So it was asked that did he write in while imitating John Day's Parliament of Bees, who was an Elizabethan writer. So Eliot says that he was not aware of this comparison. He says that at one time he heard it from Sydney in Australia, right, that this kind of parallel is there. The author himself was not aware of such things. So in that way, exploring the intention, exploring the sources which are at the background of the poem, they will only waste the energy of the critic, right? So they go on to say that critical inquiries are not to be settled by oracles, but the poem itself, right? So now we move on to the next fallacy, that is the affective fallacy, the second essay that was written by Wimsatt and Beardsley. If these critics wrote these essays because they were aware of the obstacles to objective criticism, and how they were aware that these obstacles led people away from poetry and criticism. So in this affective fallacy, Beardsley and Wimsatt, they go on to write that if intentional fallacy is a confusion between the poem and its origin, the affective fallacy is the result of confusion between the poem and its results. So it is a kind of epistemological skepticism, right? It derives from psychological effects, and it ends in impressionism and relativism, right? So, what they say that how, this affective fallacy, it has its rise when a critic tries to assess the psychological impact of a work of art or a poem, and ultimately it ends in impressionistic criticism or a kind of emotive relativism. And in this way, the object of analysis, that is the poem or the text, it itself disappears, right? So, in impressionistic criticism, we know the readers and their emotions are all. In that way, a work of art or a text is analyzed in context of those concerns, right? Here, Wimsatt and Beardsley, they start this essay in context of the theories of language, word meaning, which were already propounded by critics like I.A. Richards and C.L. Stevenson's. Stevenson's work, Ethics and Language, were very important in that context. There they, Richards and Stevenson, they make a difference between symbolic and emotive, or difference between meaning and suggestion, right? For example, a symbolic meaning in which, the word refers to something and there is a logical direct relationship between them. Emotive, that is often associated with literary use or poetic use, in which this reference is distorted. They say, Stevenson goes on to say that a word may mean and may suggest. For example, take the word athlete. What is the meaning of athlete? Athlete means a person who is actively involved in sports activities, who is interested in sports, who lives up sports. What could be the suggestion or suggestive meaning of the word athlete? If we say somebody is tall, well built, so he has an athletic personality. Now, in that case, the person may not be an athlete. So, it is a suggestion. Further on, they go on to say that, there are three shades of meaning. One is linguistic role. Linguistic role is something which stabilizes the meaning of the word. The other is descriptive or cognitive, in which, this relationship between word and meaning is variable. While this third, emotive use, emotive is something which is totally unrelated to the object itself. And in case of poetry, this emotive function of language has been emphasized, and therefore there has been a variety of interpretations that a poem may mean multiple things and it should be analyzed in so it has resulted in a kind of anarchy of meaning. And Wimsatt and Beardsley, they are warning critics or readers against being trapped in these meanderings of meaning. So, emotional congruity or associational psychology, what we can say as elaborated by J.S. Mill, they can be misnomers. Further, they say that the doctrine of emotive meaning propounded recently by the semantics has seemed to offer a scientific basis for one kind of affective relativism in poetics, the personal. They go on to say that history of affective theories, it started with Plato. Plato said that how poetry waters and feeds the passions which ought to be starved. Or even Aristotle's theory of catharsis, how it was interpreted in context of what a work of art does to the audience, how he achieves that cathartic effect. So, in terms of sublimation or relief, or how Longinus says that, a great work is capable of transporting reader into a world which was felt by the writer itself, or Tolstoy's theory of contagion, or what George Santayana says that beauty is pleasure regarded as a quality of a thing, or what I.A. Richards says that how beauty is something which produces an equilibrium of appetencies, or what Sainsbury says, grand style, in context of Dante, Shakespeare and Milton. So, they say that if you look at history of affective theories, they have been in plenty, and it is very necessary to be warned of those theories. So, they say that poetry is not something which can be analyzed in context of psychological effect or physiological effect. They say that often we say, oh, this work of art is, capable of arousing feelings like terror, tranquility, disgust. That is what they call physiological impact. So all these things are affective criticism. So, they go on to say the report of some readers that a poem or story induces in them vivid images, intense feelings, or heightened consciousness is neither anything which can be refuted nor anything which it is possible for the objective critic to take into account. Right. So, they go on to say a critic is a teacher, an explicator. A critic is not a reporter who, collects reports about the impact of a work on the readers. They further say that poetry is characteristically a discourse about both emotions and objects, or about the emotive quality of objects, and this through its preoccupation with symbol and metaphor. So, if you look at the work of art, to understand it, the best value of a work of art can be understood in context of intrinsic features, symbols, images used in the work of art. They are sufficient to tell us about the merit of that work of art. For example, they give two examples, like the murder of Duncan by Macbeth. They say that the murder of Duncan by Macbeth, if you read that play, Shakespeare has used various images, so which, fix emotions which are aroused by that work of art. And, it doesn't matter in which age this work was written and in which age it is going to be read by the writer. Similarly, they refer to that Antigone, in which the death of Polynices or burial of his body. So, they, in context of those works, they say that, poetry is a way of fixing emotions or making them more permanently perceptible when objects have undergone a functional change from culture to culture, or when, as simple facts of history, they have lost emotive value with loss of immediacy. So, in this way, I come to the end of this lecture, and here we find that how these two writers, Beardsley and Wimsatt, by writing the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy, set the ball rolling for this movement called new criticism, in which they argue that in analysis of a work of art or a text, a critic should not be distracted by the intention of the author or the impact of that work on the readers or critics. Thank you.